Before there was a killer, there was a place. To understand the autumn of 1888, you have to walk into Whitechapel slowly, the way a stranger would have walked into it then, eastward out of the city of London, away from the banks and the cathedrals, down the wide artery of Whitechapel Road, into the most crowded square mile in the British Empire. It is evening, and the gas lamps are being lit, one, by a man with a long pole who walks the same route every dusk of his life. The light they give is small and yellow and precious pools of it, spaced along the main road, with darkness pooling just as deeply between them. Off the main road, in the side streets and the courts and the alleys, there are far fewer lamps, and in some passages none at all. London in 1888 is the largest city the world has ever seen, 5.5 million people, and it is lit, where it is lit at all, by fire. The air is thick. Coal smoke from 1 million chimneys settles into the streets and mixes with river fog off the Thames into the famous London particular, a brown, breathable twilight that can swallow the far side of the street at midday. Add to it the smells, horse dung from 10,000 horses, the slaughterhouses and tanneries that the city pushed eastward out of polite nostrils, boiling cabbage, tallow, gin, wet wool, and the close human smell of too many people in too little space. Whitechapel does not look like the London of the postcards. It is the engine room of that London, the district where the labor lives that keeps the imperial capital fed, dressed, and cleaned. The numbers tell part of it. Into roughly 1 square mile of the parish of Whitechapel and its neighbors, Spitalfields, St. George's in the east, are pressed something like 250,000 people. Census takers and social reformers who went door to door found families of 8 living in single rooms. They found houses built for one household subdivided into 10. Charles Booth, the great cataloguer of London poverty, was at that very moment color-coding the city street by street for his poverty maps, and when his researchers reached the streets off Commercial Street, Dorset Street, Flower and Dean Street, Thrall Street, they reached for his darkest classification, black, for vicious, semi-criminal. Dorset Street would acquire the reputation of the worst street in London. The institution that defined these streets was the common lodging house, the doss house. For 4d. a night, you got a bed in a dormitory of strangers. For 8d. a double. The lodging houses of Flower and Dean Street alone could sleep thousands, and their kitchens, warm, lit, open late, were the living rooms of the poor. The crucial fact of the doss house, the fact on which this whole story turns, is that the bed was paid for nightly, in advance, in cash. No 4d, no bed. Every single night, thousands of people in Whitechapel had to find 4d by midnight or sleep in the street, and the deputies who ran the houses turned people they had known for years out into the dark without a second thought, because that was the system. Hold on to that detail. In the nights to come, more than one woman will be walking the streets at 2 and 3 in the morning, not because the streets are where she lives, but because she is 4d short of a bed, and the night is the only place left to earn it. Who were the people of Whitechapel? They were costermongers and dock laborers, match girls and charwomen, tailors and bootmakers and slaughtermen. They were in great numbers immigrants, Irish families displaced by famine and poverty a generation before, and more recently, tens of thousands of Jewish refugees fleeing pogroms in the Russian Empire. A wave of arrivals that had transformed whole streets, filled the district with new languages, new shops, new synagogues, and stirred, among some of the established poor, an ugly resentment that the events of 1888 would set alight. Whitechapel was poor, but it was not idle. It worked brutally hard for very little, and most of its 250,000 lived and died entirely within the law. But the margin was thin. The line between respectable poverty and destitution was a lost job, a dead husband, a drinking habit, and illness. Any one of them could drop a person from a rented room to a DOS house, and from a DOS house to the street. And at the very bottom of the margin, in the casual wards and the lodging house kitchens, was a floating population of women, most of them middle-aged, most of them mothers, most of them estranged from families by widowhood or separation or drink, who survived by whatever combination of char work, hawking, borrowing, and when there was nothing else, prostitution, that a given week required. The police estimated there were more than 1,000 such women in Whitechapel. They were the most visible and the most defenseless people in the district, out at all hours alone in the dark by necessity. It was among these women that the killer hunted. That was not incidental, it was the design. A word before the autumn begins about the women themselves, because for more than a century the story has been told as the story of the man, with the women reduced to a list of names and wounds, and in recent years historians, above all Hallie Rubenhold in her book The Five, have worked to turn the telling around. Mary Ann Nichols, called Polly, was born in 1845, a locksmith's daughter from the city. She married young, raised 5 children, and lost the marriage in bitterness and drink. She could read and write. She had been educated to a standard many of her neighbors never reached. In the last summer of her life, she had briefly held a position as a domestic servant in a respectable household, and had written to her father that she was doing well. It did not hold. By August 1888, she was back in the lodging houses of Flower and Dean Street, 42 years old, cheerful by every account even at the bottom. And on her last night she was turned away from her DOS house for want of 4pence, laughing, witnesses said, telling the deputy to save her bed, that she would soon earn it. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now. Annie Chapman had been a coachman's wife in Mayfair and Windsor. There are photographs of her from those years, composed and well-dressed. She had 3 children. One daughter died of meningitis at 12, a grief from which the family never recovered. The marriage dissolved in shared drinking. By 1888 she was 47, seriously ill. The post-mortem would find advanced disease of the lungs, and surviving by crochet work and hawking flowers. The week she died, she had been in a fistfight, was visibly unwell, and told an acquaintance, "It's no use my giving way. I must pull myself together and go out and get some money, or I shall have no lodgings." Elizabeth Stride was Swedish, born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter on a farm near Gothenburg, and had come to London as a young woman in service. She had survived more in 50 years than most lives contain. The loss of her parents, an infant daughter, a marriage, a coffee shop business. She told people she had lost her husband and children in the Princess Alice disaster, the Thames pleasure steamer sinking of 1878. It was not true. Her husband died of illness years later, but it was the story she had chosen to carry, and historians have wondered ever since what it eased in her to tell it. She was known at her lodging house as a quiet, hard-working woman who cleaned rooms for her keep. Catherine Eddowes had spent the summer of 1888 hop-picking in Kent with her partner John Kelly, the working poor's version of a paid holiday, sleeping in barns, earning harvest wages in the fresh air. They walked back to London in September with nothing, and on her last day she pawned John's boots for breakfast money. She was 46, sharp-witted, fond of singing. On the final night of her life she was actually in custody, picked up drunk on Aldgate High Street, sleeping it off in a cell at Bishopsgate Police Station. And at 1 in the morning, sober enough, she was released into the dark, because the cells were needed and the law required it. She gave the desk sergeant a false name on her way out, cheerfully. She had less than an hour to live. And Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest by 20 years, 25 years old, Irish-born by her own account, with a past she narrated differently to different friends. Wales, a young husband killed in a mine explosion, a spell in a West End house, even Paris. Almost nothing she said of herself can be verified, and perhaps not all of it was meant to be. In November 1888, she had something none of the others had. A room of her own, a single rented room at 13 Miller's Court, off Dorset Street, with a bed and a fireplace and a window. It made her, by the standards of the street, fortunate. 5 women, 2 grandmothers among them, a locksmith's daughter, a coachman's wife, a Swedish farm girl, a hop picker, a young woman with a room of her own. Remember them like this, as people walking through the first pages of this story, because the autumn is coming, and the autumn will try to reduce them to what was done to them, and we are not going to let it. Stay in the district a little longer because the nighttime economy of Whitechapel, the world the killer moved through, had a texture worth knowing. The East End never fully slept, and that is part of why the murders were possible and part of why they were so hard to solve. The markets began moving at 3 and 4 in the morning, porters and carmen heading for Spitalfields Market and Billingsgate, cat's meat men and watercress sellers starting their rounds, slaughtermen finishing night shifts at the yards off Aldgate, men walking the streets at all hours in working clothes, some of them legitimately blood-stained, none of them remarkable, night workers, dock laborers waiting for the morning call-on, policemen on fixed beats timed to the minute, lodging house deputies in lit kitchens, women coming and going from the casual wards. A man walking briskly through Whitechapel at 3:30 in the morning was not an anomaly to be remembered. He was the scenery. The beats themselves mattered. A constable in 1888 walked a prescribed route at prescribed pace, roughly 2.5 miles an hour, past the same doorways at intervals his sergeant could predict, and any observant local could learn. The killings of that autumn fit inside those intervals with a snugness that has always chilled investigators. Mitre Square was visited by Constable Watkins at 1:30 and again at 1:44, and the murder of Catherine Eddowes, beginning, middle, and end, happened entirely between his 2 passes. Either the killer enjoyed luck of an almost supernatural consistency, or he knew the rhythm of police boots in those streets, the way a fisherman knows tide tables. Both possibilities kept detectives awake. Only one of them was comfortable. And over all of it lay the dark. It is genuinely hard from inside our floodlit century to feel how dark a Victorian side street was. The gas lamps existed on the main roads. The courts and passages between them were lit, if at all, by a single bracket lamp at the entrance, and inside the courts there was nothing but whatever glow leaked from a window. 2 people standing a few feet inside a passage were, for every practical purpose, invisible. Witnesses that autumn repeatedly described couples standing in doorways and passage mouths as shapes, voices, outlines against the lesser dark of the street. The city's geography of shadow was, for the women who needed privacy to earn their 4pence, a workplace, and for the man hunting them, a perfectly prepared stage. And because we will spend this whole night in their world, take one more slow look at an ordinary Whitechapel day in 1888. Not the headlines, the day itself. It begins before light, with the knocker-up tapping at windows with a long cane, the human alarm clock, paid a few pence a week, and the first tide of boots on cobbles as the dockmen walk south for the call-on at the gates, where foremen pick the morning's labor like buyers at a market, and the unchosen walk home through the crowd they came with. The markets are already roaring. By 8 the sweatshops of the tailoring trade are at work in upstairs rooms, 14 hours over the needle for piece rates, and the match factory girls are walking to bow, and the children who have school go to the great new board schools, and the children who don't are minding babies or running errands for happiness. The day is loud in a way no modern city is loud. Iron tires on stone hooves, street cries layered over street cries. The costermongers singing their stock, organ grinders, chapel bells, the boom of the brewery drays. Food is bought in farthing quantities, a screw of tea, 2 eggs, a herring, because no one has anywhere to keep more and no money to buy it. The pub is the parlor, the bank, and the employment exchange of the district. Beer is food, gin is anesthetic, and the temperance missions wage their earnest, mostly losing war between the public houses. Sunday brings Petticoat Lane Market in the morning, best clothes out of pawn for the day where there are best clothes, and back into pawn on Monday morning, the weekly financial tide of the poor, regular as the moon. It is a hard world, but it is not a despairing one, and the people who wrote about it from inside always insisted on that. The East End of 1888 was thick with friendly societies and burial clubs, with music halls where a penny bought 2 hours of light, with neighbors who minded each other's children and pawned each other's kettles, and laid each other out at the end. The women of this story belonged to that web. They had friends who worried about them, deputies who knew their names, partners who searched for them. When each of them died, the streets did not shrug. The streets filled. Thousands lined the routes of the funerals that autumn, for women the comfortable city called outcasts, and the lodging houses emptied to walk behind the coffins of their own. That is the place the killer walked into. Not a wasteland, a parish. Poor as dirt, alive as a hive, and capable as that autumn would prove of both terror and an enormous, rough-handed tenderness. The Autumn of Terror, as the newspapers came to call it, lasted 10 weeks. It began in the early hours of Friday, the 31st of August, 1888, in a back street called Buck's Row, a dark terrace alongside a board school, one lamp at the far end. A carman walking to work at 20 to 4 in the morning saw what he took for a tarpaulin lying against a gateway. It was Polly Nichols. She had been killed where she lay, swiftly and silently, so close to sleeping households that a watchman in a yard a few doors down had heard nothing at all. The medical examination established that the killer had attacked her throat first. There had been no cry, and had then inflicted further injuries that told the doctors 2 things they did not want to know: that the act had taken some minutes, and that whoever had done it had not been interrupted, and had walked away into the dark streets covered in the evidence of it, and had simply vanished. Whitechapel had seen violence before. 2 other women, Emma Smith and Martha Tabram, had died violently earlier that year, and the press would argue for decades about whether they belonged to the same hand. But Buck's Row felt different to the men investigating it, and the difference was the silence. No robbery, no quarrel, no motive anyone could construct. The detective leading the case, Inspector Frederick Aberline, a soft-spoken, methodical man who had spent 14 years policing Whitechapel and knew its streets the way a priest knows his parish, could find nothing in Polly Nichols's hard, small life that explained her death. That was the moment, perhaps, when the case stepped outside the experience of Victorian policing. A murder with no relationship in it. The crime of a stranger. 8 days later, on the 8th of September, Annie Chapman was found at first light in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, Spitalfields, a house in which 17 people were sleeping. The yard was reached by a passage whose front door was never locked. John Davis, an elderly carman who lived on the top floor, came down a little before 6 to a sight that sent him running into the street for help. Again the silence. A household above, neighbors feet away through a wooden fence, a dawn already filling with workmen, and no one had heard anything. This time the injuries went further, and the medical examiner, Dr. George Baxter Phillips, stated at the inquest carefully, reluctantly, that the work showed indications of anatomical knowledge. The word raced through the press like fire through a hayloft. The killer was no longer imagined as a brawling local. He became, in the public mind, a figure with skill. A surgeon, a butcher, a man with clean hands by day. It is in these September days that the district itself begins to change. Crowds gather at Bucks Row and Hanbury Street, so many that residents of Hanbury Street charge a penny to view the yard from their windows. Vigilance committees form, the most famous, the Mile End Vigilance Committee under a local builder named George Lusk, begins patrolling the streets at night with whistles and stout sticks. Rumor acquires a body count of its own, a leather-aproned man menacing women. And when a slipper maker known locally as Leather Apron is named in the papers, mobs gather wherever he is rumored to be, and the man, John Pizer, who proved his alibis comprehensively, has to be taken into protective custody to save his life. The autumn's first lesson is being learned. Fear does not stay aimed. It sprays. And in a district already simmering over immigration, much of it sprays at the Jewish community, in whispers, and then in shouts that the police take seriously enough to fear a riot. 3 weeks pass. The patrols walk, the papers speculate, the lodging houses talk of nothing else, and nothing happens, and the district begins cautiously to exhale. Then comes the night of the 30th of September, the double event. At 1 in the morning, the steward of a radical workingmen's club on Berner Street drove his pony and cart into the club's side yard, and the pony shied at something in the darkness by the wall. It was Elizabeth Stride, and she had been dead only minutes, so few minutes that the steward always believed the killer was still in the yard, pressed into the blackness, while he stood there with his pony, and that his arrival had interrupted the man almost in the act. Stride's injuries stopped at the throat. Whatever pattern the killer was following, at Berner Street it was cut short. 45 minutes later, and 3/4 of a mile away, across the boundary into the city of London, into the jurisdiction of an entirely different police force, a city constable on his beat turned his lantern into the darkest corner of Mitre Square and found Catherine Eddowes. The square had been checked by the same constable 14 minutes earlier and had been empty. In those 14 minutes, in a space overlooked by warehouses and a sleeping policeman's own dwelling, the killer had done everything he had been prevented from doing in Berner Street and more, and had gone. The city police, proud and well-resourced, threw everything they had into the night. A torn piece of Eddowes' apron was found an hour later in a doorway on Galston Street, back inside Whitechapel, the killer's trail, walking east, and above it, chalked on the brickwork, a crooked sentence about the Jews that has been argued over ever since, because Sir Charles Warren, the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, fearing a pogrom at first light, ordered it washed off before it could even be photographed. The only piece of writing the killer may ever have left, if it was his at all, was erased by the man hunting him. It was in these same days that the name arrived. A letter had come to the Central News Agency days before the double event, written in red ink, mocking the police, promising more, and signed with a flourish, Jack the Ripper. After the double event, a follow-up postcard referencing the 2 killings made the agency release both to the press, and the name detonated across the world. The police came to believe, and senior officers later stated plainly, that the letter was almost certainly the invention of a journalist, a circulation man's masterpiece. It did not matter. The killer of the autumn had been nameless. Now he had the most memorable alias in criminal history, gift-wrapped by the press, and the case and the name would never again be separated. Hundreds of hoax letters followed in imitation. Among them came one parcel, addressed to George Lusk of the Vigilance Committee, containing half a human kidney and a scrawled note from hell. Whether it was a medical student's prank or the only true communication in the whole flood, no one has ever been able to say. October passed in dread and lamplight double patrols, plainclothes men in the alleys, bloodhound trials in Hyde Park, and not a single incident. The district held its breath through 5 weeks. And then, on the morning of the 9th of November, the day of the Lord Mayor's show, London's great civic carnival. A rent collector knocked at the door of 13 Miller's Court and got no answer, and reached through the broken pane of the window to push back the coat that served as a curtain. Mary Jane Kelly was the only one of the 5 killed indoors, in her own room, in her own bed, with hours of privacy behind a closed door. And that is all that needs to be said of what was found there, except this. The photographs taken in that room that morning were among the first crime scene photographs in English history, and the men who worked the scene, hardened police surgeons and detectives of long service, spoke of it for the rest of their lives as the worst thing they had ever seen. The autumn had ended the way nightmares end, not by fading, but by arriving completely. And then nothing. No more murders that the investigators could confidently assign to the same hand. No arrest. No confession that held. The killer of the autumn of 1888 stopped, or was stopped, or moved on, or died, and stepped out of history as silently as he had stepped out of Mitre Square, leaving behind 5 dead women, a terrified square mile, and a name that did not belong to him. Between the murders, the district lived in a state that the newspapers called panic, but that was really something stranger and more textured. A mixture of terror, carnival, and grim economy. The terror was real and it was specific. It belonged most of all to the women of the lodging houses, who faced each midnight with a choice the rest of London never had to imagine: the street with the knife in it, or no bed and the workhouse casual ward. Some armed themselves. There are accounts of women showing each other knives carried in their skirts. Some traveled in pairs and agreed on whistling signals. And some, in testimony that still aches to read, simply shrugged at the inquests. "We have to live," one woman told a reporter. "He can only kill us once, but the hunger kills us slow." The murders did not stop the nighttime economy of Whitechapel because nothing could afford to stop. The carnival was real too. Sightseers came east by omnibus to stare at Bucks Row and Hanbury Street. More people, the papers noted with disgust, than had ever come east for any charitable purpose. Waxworks added Whitechapel tableau within weeks. Street vendors sold broadsheet ballads about the murders outside the very lodging houses where the victims had slept. The East End, with its unkillable dark humor, absorbed even this. Children skipped rope to rhymes about the killer before the autumn was out. Horror, in a district that lived with death by fever and hunger every ordinary week, was something you wore in like weather. And through it all ran the letters. After the Dear Boss letter was published, the mania for writing to the police, the press, and the vigilance committees became a phenomenon in its own right. Hundreds upon hundreds of letters signed with the famous name, from every corner of Britain and beyond: confessions, taunts, warnings, prophecies, maps, poems. Scotland Yard had to divert men simply to read them. Nearly all were hoaxes, written by clerks and schoolboys and lonely people, and, in at least some proven cases, by women. A handful led to prosecutions for wasting police time. The autumn of 1888 discovered something about the public mind that the 20th century would confirm at scale. Give a horror a name and a postal address, and a measurable fraction of ordinary humanity will sit down at the kitchen table and join in. The killer, whoever he was, had acquired a chorus, and the chorus made him bigger, stranger, and infinitely harder to see. The inquests of that autumn deserve their own remembrance, because they were where the district spoke. A Victorian inquest was a public theater of fact. A coroner, a jury of local tradesmen, and a parade of witnesses. And the Whitechapel inquests, held in workhouse halls and institute rooms packed past the doors, put the East End itself on the record as nothing else ever had. Lodging house deputies testified about fourpence and turnouts. Night watchmen explained their rounds. Neighbors described what a scream did and did not mean in streets where screams were weather. Coroner Win Baxter, theatrical and relentless, used the Chapman inquest to advance a theory that the killer was harvesting anatomical specimens for sale to medical schools. A claim that filled a week of headlines, scandalized the medical establishment, and dissolved on examination, but which captures the era's desperate need for the crimes to have a comprehensible, even commercial, motive. Anything was easier to believe than appetite without purpose. And the witnesses, the almost witnesses, file through those inquest records like figures seen by lamplight, each one holding a corner of the truth. Elizabeth Long, who passed a man and a woman talking outside number 29 Hanbury Street at 5:30 and heard the man say, "Will you?" and the woman answer, "Yes." Israel Schwartz, who on Berner Street saw a man accost a woman minutes before Stride was found, and was so frightened by what he saw that he ran, and whose account the police took deadly seriously and the inquest mysteriously never heard. Joseph Laund, the cigarette salesman who passed a couple at the entrance to Mitre Square 9 minutes before the body was found, and whose brief glance at the man became, for the city police, the most precious 9 seconds of the autumn. A glance Laund himself insisted, with admirable honesty, was too short to swear to. George Hutchinson, who days after the Kelly murder walked into a police station with a description of a man of such novelistic detail, the dark gentleman, the gold chain, the parcel, that detectives first prized it, and have argued for a century since about whether he was the best witness of the case or the strangest of its fantasists. Out of these fragments the police assembled their composite of a man glimpsed, 30-odd, medium height, respectable enough in dress, foreign-looking to some eyes and ordinary to others, a description that fit, as one exhausted official noted, half the men in London. The witnesses had seen him. Several of them, almost certainly, had genuinely seen him. And it did not matter, because in the world before photography of the living, before fingerprints, before anything, a face seen for 9 seconds by gaslight belonged to the night, as completely as the man who wore it. To judge the hunt fairly, you have to understand what the hunters did not have. In 1888, there was no fingerprinting in British policing. That was a decade away. There was no blood typing. A stain could be called blood, but not whose, and not always even whether it was human. There were no crime scene protocols. The body of Polly Nichols was washed by mortuary attendants before the doctors arrived, destroying whatever the modern mind weeps to imagine was lost. There were no telephones to speak of, no radios. A constable who found a body had a whistle and his legs. Detection, such as it was, consisted of 3 tools: knock on every door, question every witness, and know your district so well that the abnormal shows against the normal like a figure against gaslight. By those lights, the investigation was enormous and in its way heroic. The Metropolitan Police interviewed over 2,000 people, searched hundreds of lodging houses, traced sailors off cattle boats, slaughtermen, butchers, and, pursuing the anatomical knowledge thread, checked the whereabouts of medical students and asylum dischargees across London. Inspector Aberline, coordinating on the ground, slept hardly at all that autumn. Constables were drafted in from across the city, until the East End at night held more police per street than anywhere in the empire, many in plain clothes, some, in the desperate inventiveness of the time, in rubber-soled boots to silence their tread, and a few, legend insists, in women's clothing as decoys. After Mitre Square, the City of London police ran their own parallel investigation with their own files and their own suspects, and the two forces cooperated with the polished mutual resentment of rival firms. The autumn also produced something genuinely new in the history of crime. At the request of the police, Dr. Thomas Bond, a police surgeon, reviewed the medical evidence of all 5 murders and wrote an assessment not of who the killer was, but of what kind of man he must be: solitary, outwardly inoffensive, likely middle-aged, neatly dressed, subject to periodic murderous impulse, quite possibly living among people who noticed nothing. It is recognized today as the first offender profile, the distant ancestor of every behavioral unit in every police force on Earth. The hunt for this one man, in other words, helped invent the way all such men have been hunted since. And it failed. It is worth saying simply, the men were not fools, the effort was not small, and it failed because the crime was designed, whether by cunning or by accident, to defeat exactly the tools they had. A stranger killing strangers, briefly, at night, in the most crowded and most transient square mile in Europe, leaving nothing behind that the science of 1888 could read. The killer did not outwit the Victorian police so much as he fell through the gap between what they could see and what was there. Then there are the suspects, and here the case becomes a hall of mirrors, because more than 100 names have been proposed across 135 years, and the first thing an honest accounting must say is that not one of them has ever been proven. The contemporary police files and the private memoranda of senior officers written in the years after converge on a handful of names. Montague John Drute, a barrister and schoolteacher whose body was pulled from the Thames weeks after the Miller's Court murder, and whom Assistant Chief Constable Melville Macnaghten privately favored, though Macnaghten got basic facts about Drute wrong, and the timing of his suicide is the strongest thing against him. Aaron Kosminski, a young Polish-Jewish barber from Whitechapel who descended into madness and died decades later in an asylum, named by Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson and Chief Inspector Donald Swanson as the man identified by a witness who then refused to testify against a fellow Jew. The identification is maddeningly second-hand, written in the margins of an old man's book, and historians have fought over every word of it. Michael Ostrog, a Russian con man whom Macnaghten also listed, and who turns out, on modern research, to have very likely been in a French prison during the murders, a reminder of how shaky even the official lists were. Francis Tumbledy, an American quack doctor arrested in London that autumn and fled abroad, large and loud and strange, the favorite of one special branch chief. George Chapman, Suwarin Klosowski, a Polish barber surgeon working in Whitechapel in 1888 who was later hanged for poisoning 3 wives, and of whom Aberline himself in retirement reportedly said, "You've got the Ripper at last." Poisoners, the objection has always run, do not begin with knives, and yet Aberline knew the case better than any man alive. Beyond the police lists lies the carnival, the royal conspiracy implicating the Queen's grandson, demolished by alibis but immortal in film. The painter Walter Sickert, accused on the strength of his macabre canvases, and, more recently, of mitochondrial DNA from letters that were almost certainly hoaxes to begin with. The shawl said to have been taken from Mitre Square, whose DNA analysis pointing to Kosminski electrified headlines in 2014 and was then picked apart by geneticists on provenance and method. Every few years a new book arrives with a new certainty. Every few years the certainty dissolves on inspection. The case has become a mirror. Tell me your Ripper, the historians say, and I will tell you your anxieties, about class, about foreigners, about doctors, about the establishment, about the press. The likeliest truth, most serious students of the case now suspect, is the least cinematic one, that he was a local man of no distinction, a laborer or tradesman of the district, one face among the 250,000, questioned perhaps and passed over, or never noticed at all, and that he stopped because he died, or was imprisoned for something else, or was quietly confined to an asylum by a family that never spoke of it. The most famous criminal in history may have ended his days within a mile of Buck's Row, anonymous in a pauper's grave, his secret dissolving with him into the same East End earth. Two scenes from inside the investigation deserve to be kept, because they show the hunt at its most human. The first is the matter of the bloodhounds. After the double event, with the press howling and the Home Office desperate, Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, a soldier by training, an administrator by misfortune, personally oversaw trials of two champion bloodhounds, Barnaby and Burgo, in Regent's Park and Hyde Park, including runs in which Warren himself acted as the quarry, jogging through the morning mist while the hounds tracked him. The image of the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police being hunted through a London park by dogs, in dress shoes, while the actual killer slept somewhere in the East End, was a gift to the cartoonists that the force never quite lived down. The dogs performed adequately in open parkland and were never used, a city of horse dung, fish barrows, and a million crossing scents was no place for nose work. And after Miller's Court the idea quietly died, along with, soon after, Warren's commissionership. The second is quieter. Inspector Aberline, interviewed in retirement years later, was asked, as he was always asked, whether the police had ever truly known anything. His answers across those late interviews are a study in honest exhaustion, theories entertained and abandoned, the Chapman suspicion he could never prove, and beneath it all the admission that the man had been, in the end, simply unfindable with the tools of the day. "You must remember," he said in substance, "that we were dealing with a class of crime we had never seen, in a district where half the world was a stranger to the other half. The first great serial murder investigation in modern history was run by men who did not yet have the word serial murder. They were drawing the map of a country while lost in it, at night, in fog. That they failed is the headline. That they invented, in 10 desperate weeks, half the methods their successors would refine for a century. That is the part history took longer to notice." The hunt was fought on a second front, and on that front the police lost far more decisively. The front page. The autumn of 1888 was the first great collision between a criminal investigation and a mass press operating at industrial speed. London had dozens of daily and weekly papers locked in circulation war. The new journalism of Stead and O'Connor had discovered the headline, the illustration, the interview, the special edition, and the Whitechapel murders were, in the cold language of the trade, the greatest story the new machine had ever been fed. Editions sold out within hours. Illustrated weeklies put imagined murder scenes on their covers. Reporters swarmed the district, paying lodging house residents for rumors, interviewing anyone who would speak and several who plainly invented, publishing police theories before the police held them. The Star, the most aggressive of the evening papers, all but convicted Leather Apron on its own authority, and when that collapsed, moved on without apology to the next sensation. The investigation leaked at every seam, and the killer, if he read the papers, and how could he not, was handed each morning a complete report on the state of the hunt for him. Sir Charles Warren became the press's chosen sacrifice. A distinguished engineer and archaeologist hopelessly miscast as commissioner, he had already alienated radical London by deploying troops against demonstrators in Trafalgar Square the year before. Now every barren week of the investigation was laid at his door. The erasure of the Galston Street rioting, defensible as riot prevention, indefensible as evidence handling, was reported as panic. The Bloodhound trials were reported as farce. On the 9th of November, the day Mary Jane Kelly was found, London learned that Warren had resigned, and the coincidence of dates meant that the case's darkest morning and its administrative collapse arrived in the same editions, which felt, to readers, like the system itself confessing failure. Beneath the spectacle, a quieter institutional drama played out that students of the case still map like a battlefield. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police running parallel investigations from the night of the double event onward, sharing selectively. The Home Office refusing, for weeks, to sanction a reward on the reasoning, not absurd, but fatal to public confidence, that rewards in such cases produced only perjury. Scotland Yard's detective branch, the SID, barely a decade past its own corruption scandal, fighting for credibility with every empty week. The men at the top filed memoranda at each other, while the men at the bottom walked the courts in rubber-soled boots. It is the eternal architecture of every great failed manhunt since: heroic effort below, friction above, and the press feeding on the gap between them. And here is the detail that closes the circle. When the senior men of that generation retired and wrote their memoirs, Anderson, Macnaghten, Smith of the City Force, Aberline in his interviews, they contradicted each other on the most basic questions. Each was confident. Each named or gestured at a different man. Each claimed knowledge the files do not support. The leaders of the largest manhunt of the 19th century went to their graves telling incompatible stories about how it ended, which is, perhaps, the most honest possible monument to a case that never ended at all. What remains after 135 years is not the man. It never really was. The autumn of 1888 changed London in ways the killer could never have intended and would never have understood. The glare of the world's press, trained for 10 weeks on the worst streets of the empire's capital, illuminated something the comfortable city had managed not to see: how its poorest lived. Journalists who came for blood stayed to describe the lodging houses, the wages, the fourpenny beds, the women walking at 3 in the morning because the alternative was a doorway. George Bernard Shaw observed, with bitter irony, that the killer had done more to draw attention to East End poverty than every reformer combined. In the years that followed, the worst rookeries of Spitalfields, Flower and Dean Street, first among them, were demolished and rebuilt as model dwellings. Slum clearance had many causes, but the Autumn of Terror was, undeniably, one of its engines. It is one of history's bleakest equations. The women of Whitechapel were made safer, in the end, partly by what had been done to 5 of them. The case changed policing, as we have seen. The first profile, the hard lessons about crime scenes and press management and interforce rivalry, taught at terrible cost and absorbed slowly over the following decades. It changed journalism too, and not for the better and not only for the worse. The autumn of 1888 was the laboratory of the modern tabloid, the discovery that fear sells papers faster than anything else on earth, and the name on the red ink letter was the first great viral media creation. A brand, in the exact modern sense, invented to move product, that ended by devouring the reality it described. Because that is the strangest thing about this case when you stand back from it in the dark. The killer of Whitechapel is the most famous criminal in human history, and he does not, in a meaningful sense, exist. The name is a journalist's. The face, top hat, cape, Gladstone bag, swirling fog is the theater's, assembled decades later from melodrama and Hyde and Holmes. The skill, the genius, the gentleman monster. Constructions, everyone laid over a void. Strip them away, and what is actually there is unbearably small. A man of the streets, unknown, killing the most defenseless people in London, and evading a police force that lacked the science to see him. The legend is a cathedral built over an empty grave. And while the void was being decorated for a century, the 5 women were buried twice, once in the East End earth and once under the word victim. That second burial has, in our own time, finally begun to be undone. Historians went back to the workhouse registers and the parish records and the inquest files and recovered them. Polly, who could read and write and loved her jolly bonnet. Annie, who had lived in Mayfair and never recovered from her daughter's death. Elizabeth, who crossed the sea from Sweden and carried a story about a shipwreck that eased some wound no record names. Kate, who sang and walked back from the Kent hop fields with the man she loved, and was let out of a police cell into the last hour of her life. Mary Jane, who was young, and told her own story so many ways that she kept it, in the end, for herself. They were not footnotes to a monster. He was, if anything, a footnote to the city that produced them all, and the recovery of their names, 130 years late, is the one genuinely good ending this story has ever been given. Whitechapel itself has been transformed beyond recognition, and yet not entirely. The 10 Bells public house, where some of the women drank, still pours beer on Commercial Street. Some of the old courts survive as renamed alleys between glass towers. The board school on Bucks Row, the street long since renamed Dudward Street, still stands over the spot where a carman mistook Polly Nichols for a tarpaulin. By day it is all markets and curry houses and city workers with coffee. By night, guides with lanterns lead tourists through the fog of their own imaginations, and the East End, which has been gentrifying for 40 years, regards them with the patient irony of a place that has survived absolutely everything. And the files, the actual files, sit in the National Archives at Kew, releasing their last secrets to no one, because their last secrets were never written down. Researchers still comb them. Genetic genealogists still eye the surviving artifacts and argue about contamination. Every year or two a headline announces the case solved at last, and every year or two it isn't. Some cases are machines for producing answers. This one is a machine for producing questions, and it has run without pause since the gaslight era, and it shows no sign of stopping. Perhaps that is the case's final shape, a permanent reminder kept by history on purpose that the past does not owe us closure, that some doors stay open not because no one pushed hard enough, but because the room behind them was empty before we arrived. The man gone, dissolved into the 250,000, leaving us forever with the fog, the lamps, the fourpenny beds, and 5 women whose names we know. Before the lamps go out, one last walk, this time through what the case became after everyone in it was gone. The witnesses and the detectives lived on into the 20th century carrying the autumn with them. Aberline retired to Bournemouth and grew roses and gave his careful, weary interviews. The constables who had stood guard in Mitre Square told the story to grandchildren who half believed them. The last people who could say I was there died in the years around the Second World War, and the case, instead of dying with them, did the opposite. Freed from living memory, it became pure story, and pure story travels. The first films arrived in the 1920s. The fog and top hat iconography hardened in the cinema of the 50s and 60s. And by the time the centenary came in 1988, the Whitechapel murders had become a global industry of books, tours, conferences, and a word the participants themselves coined, half in irony: ripperology. Ripperology is one of the strangest scholarly communities on earth, part historical society, part detective club, part theological dispute. Its members have produced work of genuine archival importance: census reconstructions of every house on the murder streets, biographies of constables, weather reports for every night of the autumn, the recovered lives of the 5 women themselves. They have also produced a century of mutually annihilating certainties, and they know it, and the best of them wear it lightly. Ask a serious ripperologist who did it, and the honest ones give the same answer the honest detectives gave in 1888. We don't know, and we probably never will, and somewhere along the way the question of who became less interesting than the question of why we cannot stop asking. Why can't we? Part of the answer is mechanical. The case is the perfect engine of mystery, a bounded cast, a vivid stage, a real monster and a permanently missing final page. Part of it is darker, and the recent reckoning has insisted we say it aloud. The legend was built, for a century, on the suffering of poor women, retold as entertainment with their humanity edited out. And the tourism and the merchandise and the smiling cartoon ghost in the top hat have something to answer for. The renaming of the conversation in our own time, away from the killer's myth and toward the women's lives, away from the puzzle and toward the history, is not the end of the fascination. But it is, perhaps, the beginning of its redemption. The same lamplight finally turned the other way. And under all of it, the East End keeps its own council, as it always has. The district that absorbed the Huguenots, the Irish, the Jews of the Pale, the Bengalis of the 20th century, that survived the autumn of 1888 and the Blitz that flattened half its streets, that watched the worst street in London become a car park, and then a development of glass. Whitechapel has outlived its monster so completely that the fog figure now belongs more to Hollywood than to Hanbury Street. The real inheritance of the autumn is not down an alley with a lantern tour. It is in the housing built where the rookery stood, in the science of every modern investigation, in 5 recovered names on a page, and in the old, hard, East End knowledge that the dark is survivable because it was survived. It is late now. The lamplighter has long since finished his round, and the fires are banked, and even Whitechapel eventually sleeps. Let the autumn of 1888 keep its one secret. We have recovered the 5 that matter. Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Kate, Mary Jane. Sleep well.